Good evening all and welcome back to Untold Fears. Tonight the sun has abandoned the horizon and the deep woods of Alaska are drowning in endless polar night where porch lights glow like shipwrecks and footsteps vanish into snow that never melts. Out here, radios die without warning, roads end in white nothing, and ordinary people stumble into horrors no map or weather report can prepare them for. Some of them meet something human, some of them meet something else entirely, and a few are never seen again, leaving only half-finished messages and scars in the ice. If you're new here, make sure to subscribe to Untold Fears for daily true horror content that will keep you up at night. Hit that notification bell so you never miss when the darkness calls. Now, let's step into the shadows of the Appalachian deep woods, where civilization ends and terror begins. The first thing you learn about the polar night is that the dark is not empty. It presses against the windows, seeps through the seams of the walls, and settles in your bones like a second heavier skin. I took the winter caretaker job at the old radar station because I thought I knew how to handle that kind of darkness. I grew up in small Alaskan towns where daylight in winter was a rumor, and people went weeks without seeing the sun. The pay was good, the contract was short, and they promised it would mostly be babysitting old equipment. It sounded simple. It was anything but. The station sat a few miles outside a tiny coastal community, far enough that the village lights were only a faint glow on the horizon when the sky was clear. The building itself was a squat concrete block, topped with a white radar dome that looked like a cracked egg in the distance. Most of the sophisticated systems had been updated and moved elsewhere years ago, but the old shack still hummed with backup communication gear and a few legacy antennas that the government had not gotten around to tearing down yet. My job was to keep the place warm, check in twice a day on the radio, and make sure the pipes did not freeze. That was it. One person, one building, 60 days a night. During the first week, the isolation felt almost peaceful. I arrived just as the last pale band of sun slipped below the horizon for the season. The crew that dropped me off showed me how to start the generators, walked me through the maintenance logs, and pointed out the little bunk room in the back where I would sleep. Then they climbed into the truck, headlights carving a short tunnel through the dark, and drove back toward the village. Their taillights vanished over a rise, and for the first time, I was alone with the station's low mechanical heartbeat and the endless black sky. I settled into a routine. Morning coffee, even though morning meant nothing anymore. A quick walk around the building to check for snowdrifts against the doors. A log entry in the binder on the wall. A call on the radio to confirm everything was normal. After that, I read, watched downloaded movies, or listened to music while the wind blew loose snow across the gravel lot and rattled the metal siding. The building creaked and sighed like an old ship. When you are the only person within shouting distance, you learn every sound quickly. That is why, on the 7th night, the new sound stood out immediately. It came from the radio room, just after what I called dinner time. A low hiss cutting through the usual static. I was rinsing a plate in the tiny sink when I heard the faint whisper and the soft click of a relay engaging. The radio was set to the standard check-in channel, volume low. No one was scheduled to call. I dried my hands and walked down the narrow hallway, boots thudding on the worn linoleum, the air smelling faintly of dust and old wiring. The glow from the equipment, racks, painted the room in soft green and amber. At first, I thought it was just interference from the wind or some distant storm. The speakers crackled, then fell quiet, then crackled again. I leaned over and adjusted the volume knob with my thumb. The static cleared for a heartbeat, and in that brief silence, I heard it. A voice, male, flat, and filtered by distance, like someone speaking from the bottom of a well. "Station, come in." I froze. The call sign that followed was one I had never heard before, a string of letters and numbers that did not match the paperwork taped to the console. It sounded old, like something from a different era. I swallowed, thumb hovering over the microphone button. "This is the station," I said, trying to sound calm. "Identify yourself." There was a long pause. The wind howled somewhere outside, the building shuddering slightly with a gust. Then the voice came back. "You are not supposed to be there, Ashton." Hearing my name hit me harder than the words themselves. I'd never given my name on the radio. The regular check-ins were scripted, just the assigned call sign and a status code. For a moment, I thought it was a joke from someone in town, maybe a bored operator messing with the new caretaker. But something in the tone, flat, almost tired, did not match the sloppy laughter you hear when people prank call each other on open channels. I clicked the microphone again, my mouth dry. "Who is this?" Static swallowed the reply. The speaker hissed, then shrieked briefly, a high whine that made my teeth ache. I flinched and pulled the volume down, standing there with my pulse ringing in my ears. After a minute of dead air, I turned the radio off, more annoyed than scared. I told myself it was a misguided transmission from somewhere far away, bouncing weirdly off the ionosphere. That was a thing that happened, right? Odd signals skipping across the planet in strange ways. I repeated that explanation to myself all evening like a mantra, until I finally drifted off in the bunk room to the dull throb of the generator. The next night, the voice came back. This time, it woke me. I sat up in the bunk in complete darkness, disoriented, heart hammering. The building was quiet except for the wind and the low hum of machinery. Then I heard the soft pop of the radio relay again, followed by that same distant, hollow voice drifting down the hallway. It was not loud, but in the stillness, every syllable sounded sharp. "Do you hear them, Ashton?" I did not want to, but I climbed out of bed and grabbed my headlamp, the beam slicing through the narrow corridor. The radio room doorway glowed faintly from the panel lights. I stepped inside, the air colder here than in the bunk room. The chair before the console was empty, spinning slightly as if someone had just vacated it. I had left it pushed in. I raised the volume. "Who is this?" I asked again. The voice did not answer that question. Instead, it laughed, a flat, humorless sound. Then the speaker filled with a new noise, like 100 tiny taps, as if something was flicking the metal skin of the building from the outside. It moved around me from left to right, from the ceiling to the floor, scratching at the edges of my hearing. My scalp prickled. "They are walking on the roof again," the voice said conversationally. "They do not know you are awake." I looked up on instinct, though I knew there was nothing to see except pipes and insulation. The roof was flat, accessible only by an exterior ladder that I had checked earlier that day. There had been no tracks in the snow, no birds, no fox, no anything. The nearest human being was miles away, in a village where the lights went out early to save fuel. I broke eye contact with the ceiling and leaned closer to the radio. "Where are you transmitting from?" I asked. "What is your call sign?" There was a crackle, then a brief burst of static that sounded suspiciously like the syllables I had heard the previous night, the strange string of letters and numbers. I scribbled them down on a notepad, hand shaking, then reached for the binder on the shelf. The list of active stations did not include that code. The list of decommissioned ones did. According to the notes, that station had shut down over 30 years ago. Sleep did not come easily after that. I lay in my bunk, listening for footsteps on the roof, half expecting to hear boots crunching on snow, half expecting to hear nothing, and decide I had finally lost my mind. Instead, I heard the wind tugging at the edges of the building and the occasional groan of shifting ice. Normal sounds, I told myself. Perfectly normal. The radio stayed quiet until the following afternoon. I was in the small storage room checking the fuel levels when I heard my own voice echo faintly from the radio room. It stopped me cold. I'd left the door propped open for airflow, and the sound carried down the hall in a warped, delayed way, like an old recording. I set the clipboard down and walked slowly toward it, every hair on my arm standing up. "What is your call sign?" my voice asked from the speaker. It was the exact phrase I had used the previous night, the same cadence, the same slight catch on the last word. Then silence. Then faintly, a sound I knew I had not made. A slow, scraping breath. The chair in front of the console was turned slightly toward the doorway now. I was sure I had left it facing the panel after my last shift. I stepped inside, keeping my distance from the equipment rack, and reached out to switch the radio off again. Before my fingers touched the knob, the voice returned. "You will not like the recording, Ashton." The temperature seemed to drop another 5 degrees. "What recording?" I asked, though part of me already knew. There was a soft click. The static disappeared. In its place, another sound faded in. The harsh, panicked breathing of a man running, the slap of boots on metal, and the distant slam of a door. Then my voice again, but this time filled with raw fear I had never heard from myself. "Open the door. Somebody please, open the..." The scream cut off mid-word, replaced by a wet crunch and a heavy thud. The noise that followed was not human. It was a dragging sound, slow and patient, like something heavy being pulled down a long corridor. I slapped the power switch so hard I hurt my hand. The room dropped into sudden muffled silence, the panel lights still glowing, indifferent. I stared at the dead radio, heart pounding. I'd never made that recording. I'd never run down any corridor here, never screamed for anyone to open any door. But it was my voice. Every inflection, every breath. A version of me, somewhere, someone, begging for help I never received. That night, I did not sleep at all. I sat at the small kitchen table, fingers wrapped around a mug of coffee gone cold hours earlier, listening to the wind circle the building. Every creak sounded like a footstep. Every gust sounded like a distant voice. The rational part of my mind tried to assemble explanations. A misrouted transmission, an old tape bleeding into the frequency, a glitch in recording equipment I did not know about. The rest of me, the part that had grown up listening to elders talk about voices in the snow and lights that led people off safe paths, knew better. On the last day of my shift, the weather cleared just enough for the relief crew to drive in. When the truck finally appeared out of the darkness, headlights cutting through swirling ice crystals, I felt a pressure in my chest ease that I had not realized was there. The two men who stepped out stomped their boots on the step, their laughter loud and normal in the cramped entryway. They smelled like cold air and cigarette smoke and town. I wanted to hug them. They joked about the endless night as they shrugged off their parkas, asked if I had seen any northern lights, any foxes, any of the usual things. I answered mechanically, signed the paperwork, and handed over the maintenance log. I did not mention the voice, or the recordings, or the nights I had spent staring at the ceiling, waiting for footsteps on the roof. I glanced back at the radio room only once, just before we left. The chair was facing the panel again, perfectly centered, like no one had touched it. On the way back to the village, with the station shrinking behind us into a small lump on the horizon, one of the guys lit a cigarette and cracked his window. He asked casually if I had any trouble with the radios. I hesitated. "What do you mean?" I asked. He shrugged. "Sometimes they pick up weird stuff out here. Old calls, echoes, that kind of thing. My uncle swore he heard his own voice up there once. Gave him the creeps. He said it sounded like he was calling from a place he never made it back from." I looked out at the black line of the sea and the faint glow of the village ahead. For a moment, I pictured the station still humming behind us. Empty hallways, lit by flickering fluorescents. The radio quietly clicking on in the night with no one there to answer. "Yeah," I said finally, my mouth dry. "I believe him." People think the polar night is just ordinary darkness that lasts a little longer than usual. They do not understand that after a few weeks without the sun, your sense of time and your sense of reality start to fray in all the same places. When I took the winter research assistant position in Utqiagvik, I thought I was prepared for that. I had done 2 winters in Fairbanks. I had pulled all-nighters through finals. And I had stared at enough data sets to know what sleep deprivation feels like. I told myself, This would just be a more extreme version of what I already knew. I was wrong. My job was simple on paper. Every night, I sat in a cramped monitoring room at the edge of town and watched instruments record the aurora. Our lab focused on brightness and movement patterns during geomagnetic storms. Panels glowed with live feeds from sky cameras. Rows of numbers refreshed every second, and an ancient desktop hummed, logging it all. The only window was a narrow slit high on the wall, and after the sun dipped below the horizon for the season, that window showed nothing but the suggestion of stars and the faint smear of the Milky Way when the clouds stayed away. During the first 2 weeks, the work felt almost peaceful. I made coffee at what the clock insisted was 8 p.m., walked across the frozen gravel to the lab while the village lights twinkled behind me, and settled in. The aurora would flare and fade on my screens, green curtains rippling silently across the black sky, sometimes tinged with purple or red. I would run scripts, annotate spikes, email my advisor a brief summary, and then walk home in a darkness so complete that my headlamp seemed to cut through a wall rather than shine into open air. My footsteps on the snow were loud, my breath puffed white, and the town was always quiet by the time I locked my apartment door behind me. The first time I heard the counting, I thought it was my imagination. It was a Tuesday, or what the schedule called Tuesday because the calendar becomes almost abstract when the days all look identical outside. Activity was low that night. The aurora was a faint smudge near the horizon. The magnetometers were calm, and I was alone in the lab with the quiet tick of the wall clock and the soft hum of the heater. I'd been staring at a line of numbers so long that the digits seemed to float. Somewhere outside the room, very faint, I heard someone whisper, 1. I lifted my head, heart skipping. The building had 2 rooms, the main monitoring space and a small gear closet. The door to the hallway was locked. I knew because I had checked it 3 times out of habit. I sat there, listening. The heater kicked on with a low whoosh. A minute passed. Then, through the thin wall near the window, the voice came again. 2. It was neither male nor female, not clearly. Just a breathy syllable, drawn out slightly, like a child counting slowly in the dark. I stood up, my chair scraping the floor, and crossed the room in 3 quick steps. The hallway beyond the locked door was dark when I cracked it open, my headlamp's beam illuminating nothing but white cinder block and a red exit sign at the far end. No voices, no footsteps, just the wind hissing faintly around the building's corners. I told myself I had misheard. Maybe it was the heater, maybe it was a distant radio. I went back to my chair, shook my head, and returned my eyes to the screen. The graph had begun to show a slight rise in activity. The aurora camera feed brightened, green intensifying over the station, pixels dancing in more chaotic patterns than before. As the brightness climbed, the numbers refreshed faster. Somewhere just above the window, the voice whispered, 3. The hair at the back of my neck stood up. This time the syllable came with the faintest scrape, like fingers dragging lightly along the outside of the wall. I swallowed hard, reached for the radio on the desk, and almost called the main research facility to ask if anyone was nearby as a joke. But I stopped. What was I going to say? I hear someone counting outside my window. Can you come check? I toggled the radio off instead and pushed my headphones over my ears, turning the music up just enough to cover any more sounds. For the rest of the night, I worked with something tight and coiled sitting in my chest. Every time the aurora brightened on the screen, I imagined a face just outside the glass watching. The next shift, I told myself, would be better. It was not. The second night it happened, the counting started at 4. That felt wrong, like I had missed numbers in between, like something had been keeping track while I pretended not to hear. This time I checked outside the building. I put on my parka, pulled my hat down over my ears, and stepped out into air so cold it burned my sinuses. The sky above me was alive, ribbons of green bending and twisting from horizon to horizon. I turned slowly in a circle, scanning the snowdrifts, the gravel lot, and the short trail back toward town. No footprints but mine, no shadows moving at the edge of the light. The sound did not follow me out here. It waded back inside. By the fourth week of polar night, I was sleeping in ragged 2-hour stretches during the day and existing mostly on caffeine and routine. The counting had become part of that routine. It never started at the same time, but it always returned. Sometimes it came from the window wall, sometimes from the ceiling, sometimes from what felt like just over my shoulder. Always a single number at a time, never more than one every few minutes, and never loud enough that I could have recorded it as proof. If I pulled my headphones off in a panic and stared at the clock, seconds would tick by in silence, and then a number would drift through the room like a breath held too long and finally let go. 7, 12, 13. I tried to tell a friend back at the university during one of our rare video calls. The connection was laggy, my face pale and grainy in the monitor glow. He laughed at first, made a joke about me finally getting the classic winter cabin fever, then stopped when he saw I was not smiling. "Maybe install a camera," he suggested. "If it is some weird resonance or something, at least you will know." The idea of pointing a camera at that little window and watching the feed in replay later made my stomach knot. I did not want to see what might be there when I was not looking. Besides, the voice never spoke when anyone else might hear it. Once, when a tech from town came out to fix a flaky sensor, I almost cheered. We worked together for 3 hours in that cramped room, while the aurora danced above our heads. Not a single whisper. The moment he left and his taillights vanished, the counting resumed right where it had stopped. 21. I started to notice something else around that time. On nights when the counting was most frequent, the data got strange. The aurora brightness graph would show small, regular spikes, evenly spaced, even when the visual feed showed nothing out of the ordinary. At first, I thought it was a glitch. I reran the logging software, checked the cables, power cycled the sensors. The spikes remained. When I overlaid them on a timeline, my skin went cold. The spikes matched the times I had written down the numbers. It was not perfect. I had not been logging every single count, only the ones that startled me so badly that my hand flew to the pen without thinking. But the pattern was there. A spike a few seconds after 8. Another after 14. A taller one after 20. Each one small enough to ignore as noise, but taken together, a ladder of anomalies climbing into the night. By then, I was jumpy all the time. I kept the blinds on my apartment windows closed, even during the short twilight. When wind knocked snow off the roof, I flinched. Small, rational parts of my brain kept raising one eyebrow and muttering about stress and lack of sleep, but the rest of me was listening for the next number, waiting to see what happened when it ran out of breath or reached some invisible limit. That limit came on a night that the forecast had promised would be quiet. The magnetometers were calm. The sky over the lab was black and empty on the monitor, stars faint and scattered. I was halfway through a cup of coffee that tasted like burnt rubber when the heater clicked off and left the room unnaturally silent. In that silence, very clearly just above the window, the voice said, 40. The sound was different this time, sharper. Less like a whisper and more like someone speaking very softly into my ear. I stood up so fast that the chair toppled backward. My pulse hammered in my neck. The panel lights seemed too bright, bleaching the edges of the room. "Enough," I said aloud, surprising myself with the anger in my own voice. "What? Do you want?" For a moment, there was only the soft hum of the electronics. Then, from the ceiling, the counting resumed. Faster now, no longer leaving long gaps for me to breathe. 41, 42, 43. The numbers tumbled over each other, each word harsh and clear. My scalp prickled, and an unnerving sensation washed over me, like the floor had tilted slightly under my feet. The air felt heavy. The monitors flickered. On the screen showing the sky, the stars blurred, brightened, and then smeared into green light that had not been there a moment before. I backed away, until my shoulders hit the far wall. The voice did not stop. 44, 45, 46. With each number, a new spike slammed upward on the aurora brightness graph, higher and sharper than before. My ears rang. My vision narrowed. I realized with a clarity that felt almost detached that the numbers were not aimed at me. They were describing something. They were measuring. 47. The light over the lab flashed as if something had exploded far above us. The sky camera feed went white for a second, then red, then sputtered into corrupted static. My breath came in short, panicked bursts. Somewhere very far away, a rational voice said that there must have been a geomagnetic event, a power surge, something the equipment was not built to handle. On top of that voice, drowning it, the whisper kept going. 48, 49. My heart slammed against my ribs. I knew with a certainty that did not feel like logic that I did not want to hear 50. My fingers fumbled for the main power switch on the rack. I grabbed it and yanked. The room plunged into darkness. The screens went black, the humming stopped, and for the first time in weeks, the counting cut off mid-breath. In the sudden silence, the only sound was my own breathing and the wind clawing at the walls. I stood there, shivering in the dark, my hand still wrapped around the dead switch. After a long minute, I clicked on my headlamp. The beam swept over silent consoles, lifeless screens, and the narrow black eye of the window. Nothing looked different, but nothing felt the same. I kept the system off for the rest of that shift. In the report I sent to my advisor later, I wrote about an unexplained power issue and a corrupted data file around 02.17. I did not mention the numbers. I did not mention that when I reopened the log the next day, the last valid entry before the corruption flag was a perfect spike labeled 49.8. Our work got a small mention in a conference abstract months later, a footnote about an odd instability in auroral brightness during a period that had not been predicted to be active. My name was on it. I read the line 3 times and felt nothing but nausea. I left Utqiagvik at the end of the season and turned down the offer to come back. I tell myself, in daylight, that what I heard was stress, isolation, and my own brain trying to find patterns where there were none. That the numbers were just random creaks, timed too neatly by chance. But some nights when I lie awake in my apartment hundreds of miles away, I can feel that heavy air again. Once, when insomnia had me staring at the ceiling at 3 a.m., I thought I heard a soft breath near the window and a single patient word. 50. The first thing you learn, driving the haul roads in winter, is that the dark has weight. It sits on the hood of your truck, eats the reach of your high beams, and presses in from the sides so hard that the narrow strip of snow in front of you starts to feel like the only real thing left in the world. I have been a long-haul trucker in Alaska for years, and I thought I had seen just about everything the polar night could throw at me. Black ice, sudden whiteouts, moose standing in the lane like statues. But until that run during the deep winter a few years back, I'd never picked up a man who made me wish I had just kept driving. Dispatch called it an easy bonus job. One more load up the Dalton before the weather window slammed shut for a few days. Fuel and supplies for a mining camp north of Coldfoot, nothing unusual. The company dangled extra pay for anyone willing to take it, and I let the dollar signs talk louder than my common sense. A storm was coming, but it was still a day out on the radar, and I told myself I would be back down to Fairbanks by the time it arrived. I left in what the clock said was mid-afternoon. Outside, the world was already black. The only hint of the sun was a faint blue bruise over the southern horizon. I fueled up, checked my chains, and started north. The first hours passed in a kind of tunnel vision trance. The road unspooled ahead of me, gray and white under the lights, occasionally flashing with reflective markers. Snow blew sideways in thin sheets that looked like ghosts sprinting across my path. The CB was mostly quiet, a few voices crackling in and out from other rigs, some chatter from a plow crew farther ahead. Somewhere past the Yukon River, the traffic died entirely. The sky thickened with cloud, swallowing what little ambient glow there had been. It was like driving through the inside of a closed fist. I rolled down the window a crack a few times just to hear the tires hissing over packed snow and remind myself I was still moving. The cold air that came in through that slit bit my lungs like broken glass. I was about 20 miles south of a lonely marker I knew as mile 147 when I saw the figure on the shoulder. My first thought, stupidly, was that it was a sign or some kind of post that I had never noticed before. It did not move as I approached, just stood there at the edge of the light. Then the outline sharpened. Bulky parka, hood up, one arm weakly raised. I cursed under my breath and eased off the throttle. Nothing good happens when there is a person on foot on that road in that weather. Either they are in trouble or they are about to be. I pulled as far right as I dared, set my brakes, and watched my own brake lights turn the snow behind me red. The man reached me as I climbed carefully down from the cab. Up close, he looked rough. Ice clung to the fur around his hood. His beard was a stiff white crust from his breath freezing. His eyes were wide and bloodshot, and his hands shook badly when he took off one glove long enough to grab the rail. "You heading north?" he asked, voice hoarse. "Yeah," I said. "You all right?" "Need to get away from here," he muttered, not really answering. "Cabin back off the road. They're not going to be happy I left." That sentence sat wrong with me immediately. "They who?" I asked. He glanced back into the dark, as if expecting to see someone standing there. There was only the road and the weight of the night. "Hunters," he said finally. "Guys at the camp. They keep people there sometimes. Lock them up through the winter. Play games." His tone was flat, almost rehearsed, like he had said it in his head 100 times and now he was just letting the words fall out. My skin crawled under my layers. I looked past him, trying to see any trace of a side trail or a parked vehicle. The snow was churned, where he had staggered up onto the shoulder, but beyond that, the tundra was smooth and blank. "How far back?" I asked. "A few miles," he said. "Through the trees. You cannot see it from here." Every instinct I had screamed that this was a terrible idea. Pick up no one. Trust no one, my old trainer used to say. But leaving him there to freeze was not an option I could live with, even if his story made my stomach twist. I opened the passenger door and jerked my head toward the steps. "Get in," I said. "We will talk while I drive." He climbed up clumsily, boots knocking against the metal. Inside, the cab filled with the smell of sweat, cold wool, and something metallic under it like old blood. He sat stiffly on the passenger seat, gloved hands clasped on his knees, staring straight ahead. I got the rig rolling again, feeling the weight of the trailer tug as the wheels caught traction. For a while, we rode in silence, the engine's growl and the low whine of the tires the only sounds. I kept stealing glances at him. He had not pushed his hood back. His eyes reflected the dashboard lights in a way that made me think of an animal caught in a spotlight. "You say they keep people in that cabin," I said finally. "What kind of people?" He shrugged, a small, tight gesture. "Whoever they can get. Hitchhikers, seasonal workers, a couple of tourists last year. Said they were just teaching them respect for the land. Said no one will miss some idiot who comes north unprepared." My hands tightened on the wheel. Stories like that float around every remote place in the world. Bar talk about missing backpackers, rumors about off-grid weirdos. You do not usually hear them from someone who claims to have been on the inside. "How did you get out?" I asked. His mouth twitched in something that was not quite a smile. "They think I am weak," he said softly. "They drink a lot. They get sloppy." He looked down at his hands for a moment, flexing his fingers. "They forgot to lock one of the chains this time." I did not ask for more detail. I was not sure I wanted to know. The miles crawled by. The storm edge was closer now. I could see the snow thickening in the cone of my headlights, flakes swirling like white insects. The wind started to shove at the side of the trailer. I checked the clock. If everything went smoothly, I could still make the camp, drop the load, and turn around before conditions got truly bad. About half an hour later, a gas station sign appeared in the distance, a dull rectangle of yellow bleeding through the black. It was one of those all-purpose stops you find on the haul road. Fuel, a tiny store, maybe a cot in the back for stranded drivers. The place looked half buried in drifts. One of the overhead lights flickered. "We will stop here," I said. "Top off, grab coffee. You can warm up and call someone from inside." The man beside me did not answer at first. When I glanced over, he was smiling faintly at the windshield. "They do not answer the phone here," he said. Something in his tone chilled me more than the temperature outside. "You've been here before?" I asked. "Everyone has," he said, "if they make it this far. I pulled into the lot anyway. Habit and hope are hard to shake." The pumps were on. The digital numbers glowed. The store windows were lit, warm rectangles in the dark. I could see shelves inside, a counter, a coffee pot on a hot plate. No people. "Wait here," I told him. "I'll check it out." He shrugged again and leaned back, eyes following me as I climbed out. The wind slapped my face as soon as I stepped down. Snow scoured the lot, curling around my boots in little eddies. I walked to the store door and tried it. It opened easily, a small bell chiming overhead as I stepped in. The heat hit me like a wall. The smell of stale coffee, fuel, and something fried hung in the still air. Fluorescent lights buzzed above me. It should have felt comforting, like every other lonely roadside stop I had ever been in. But my skin crawled. The place was too neat. No snow tracked on the floor. No half-finished cups at the tables. No jackets on the hooks. The coffee pot was half full, the burner on low, but there was no steam. When I touched the glass, it was barely warm. "Hello?" I called. My voice sounded small in the space. "Anyone here?" Silence answered. I walked slowly along the aisles, past racks of chips and jerky. Everything looked arranged, staged almost, like a set in a play waiting for actors. On the far wall, a corkboard held up faded flyers and a cluster of missing person notices. I recognized the generic faces and dates from state bulletins. Hikers, hunters, a couple from out of state. At the bottom of the board, newer sheets were pinned hastily in a row. No names, just photos of vehicles, a Subaru, a rental SUV, a pickup with a camper shell. The last one made my stomach drop. It was a grainy shot of a semi taken from behind. The company logo and the partial plate matched my rig. I backed away, heart pounding. That picture could have been pulled from a traffic cam somewhere, I told myself. It did not mean anything. Pictures get reused. Old flyers get left up. But when I turned back toward the counter, I noticed the small security monitor on the wall behind it. Its screen divided into 4 black and white feeds. One showed the lot, my truck idling, exhaust blooming in the cold. The passenger door was open. There was no one in the cab. I did not think. I just ran. The wind took my breath as I burst back outside. Snow whipped my face. The passenger side of the truck yawned open, empty. Footprints led away from the steps, across the lot, and around the back of the building. Not the staggered, dragging prints of a half-frozen man, but even confident strides. I hit the steps and climbed into the cab, slamming the door behind me. The interior was still warm from our shared breath. The faint smell of him hung in the air, sweat, wool, that metallic undertone. On the passenger seat, something glinted. I picked it up without thinking. It was a key. Old-fashioned, heavy, with a long notch shaft and a loop worn smooth by handling. Threaded through the loop was a strip of red fabric, stiff with what I knew, without wanting to know, was dried blood. Adrenaline roared in my ears. I threw the truck into gear, tires slipping briefly before biting. I did not care about fuel anymore. I wanted distance. As I pulled out of the lot, I glanced once in the side mirror. For a second, I thought I saw 3 figures standing at the edge of the light, just beyond the pumps. They were bundled in heavy parkas, faces hidden, each one holding something long in one hand. Rifles, maybe, or chains. The wind blew a veil of snow across them, and when it cleared, they were gone. I drove. I did not stop at the mining camp. I called dispatch on the CB, voice shaking, and told them the storm was worse than forecast, that I was turning back for safety. They swore at me, threatened write-ups, then grudgingly told me to be careful. I did not mention the hitchhiker. I did not mention the gas station with its warm lights and empty rooms. The storm hit full force an hour later. White swallowed the road, and I crawled along behind the faint glow of a plow truck that had appeared like a guardian out of nowhere. When I finally made it back to Fairbanks, 12 hours behind schedule, I parked the truck and sat with the engine off, hands still locked on the wheel. I kept the key. It sits in a drawer in my house now, wrapped in an old rag. Sometimes, when the winter is deep and the sun does not rise for days at a time, I take it out and turn it over in my palms. It is cold, no matter how long I hold it. I have never gone back up the Dalton during polar night. I tell people it is because I am getting older, because the roads are harder on my back these days, because I would rather stick to routes with more traffic and better pay. The truth is simpler. Somewhere off that road, a cabin waits in the trees, doors that lock from the outside, and men who call themselves hunters. Somewhere at mile 147, a gas station keeps its lights on, and its coffee warm for travelers who do not notice that no one ever stands behind the counter. And somewhere in the dark between them, a man in a frozen hood smiles at the oncoming headlights, waiting for the next driver who cannot leave a stranger to die on the side of the road. There is a kind of silence that only exists on the ice roads. It is not the quiet of a sleeping neighborhood or a calm forest. It is the silence of miles of frozen river, of snow-choked banks and bare trees standing like black teeth against a sky that never really brightens. When you kill the engine, the world stops. No birds, no running water, no distant traffic, just your own heartbeat and the faint groan of ice shifting under your boots. That was the silence I grew up with, and the silence I thought I understood, right up until the night I realized something else was traveling under that ice with us. I was 26 that winter, on my second year riding shotgun with my cousin on the seasonal ice road. The village where I was born might as well have been on its own planet once the river froze. The only way in or out for months was the temporary road they carved over the ice once it thickened enough. Trucks brought fuel, food, mail, all the things that kept people there alive and willing to stay. My cousin Hayden had driven the route for years and finally let me come along to learn the ropes, as he called it. I called it an excuse to get out of town for a few nights. On the day the story begins, the polar night was at full strength. The sky had settled into that permanent pre-dawn blue-black that made noon look like evening. The temperature had dropped hard, the kind of cold that made your eyelashes freeze together if you blinked too slowly. We loaded up in town before what the clock called morning. Diesel, food pallets, a few crates marked for the clinic. The usual. Some of the elders stood and watched as we strapped everything down, their breath floating in white clouds. They did not like the ice road. They used it because they had to, but they still muttered old warnings about water that pretends to be land. River is generous, one of them said to me as I tightened a strap, but it remembers every footprint. I smiled and nodded because that is what you do, but the words followed me into the cab. We drove out of town with chains on the tires, the truck heavy and sure. The first stretch was over hard ground, through a stand of spruce that formed a dark tunnel around the road. After an hour, the trees thinned, and the river appeared ahead, a wide white ribbon set between low, shadow-blotted banks. The transition from earth to ice is always strange. There's a small ramp, packed and smoothed, where plows have shaved away the snow to reach the frozen water. Signs mark the edge, speed limits, weight limits, reminders to leave plenty of space between vehicles so the ice does not flex too much in any one spot. Hayden drove. I watched the gauges and the wide expanse of nothing sprawled ahead of us. The ice glowed faintly in the headlights, scarred with a network of cracks that twisted like veins beneath the smooth top layer. Snow had drifted against small ridges here and there, sculpted by the wind, into low, rounded shapes. Steel markers stuck up every few yards along the center line, thin rods with strips of reflective tape that blinked back our light. "First time this far?" Hayden asked. "First time as an adult," I said. "Mom kept me in town when I was a kid. Said the river did not need more of our family walking on its back." He chuckled, but there was not much humor in it. She is not wrong. We settled into the slow, steady crawl that ice roads demand. Too slow, and you risk sinking into your own ruts. Too fast, and you set up waves in the ice that can crack it. 90 minutes passed, maybe more. On the ice, time stretches. The gauges stayed steady, the engine hummed, and the world beyond our windshield remained a flat, endless sheet of white, broken only by the dark lines of the banks. The first odd thing was the radio. We kept one channel open to talk to any other drivers, one for the dispatcher back near town. About halfway to the halfway point, both channels fizzed and went dead at the exact same moment. No static, no gradual fade, just a soft pop, and then silence. Hayden frowned and tapped the radio face with one gloved knuckle. "That is new," he muttered. "Maybe we are in a bad spot for signal," I offered, though we had never had that problem here before. The antennas were tall, the line of sight clear. He clicked through channels. All empty. No chatter, no background hiss. Just the faint electronic hum of powered equipment. After a minute, he shook his head and let it go. "We will check it when we stop," he said. "Eyes on the markers for now." I tried to focus on those thin rods ahead, counting them as they flashed past. 1, 2, 3, 4. The road curved gently with the river's natural bend. The banks rose a little on our right, a low cliff of frozen dirt and scrub. On the left, the ice ran out into open, dark nothingness where the river widened into what would be a lake in summer. That was when I saw the other tracks. At first, I thought it was a trick of the light. The wind had scuffed the surface here and there, leaving soft patterns. But as the headlights swept across the ice, the pattern resolved into something too regular to be random. Ahead of us, off to the right side of the marked road, a set of tire tracks ran parallel to our route. "Do you see that?" I asked. "See what?" "Right side. Tracks." Hayden leaned forward, squinting. The truck rolled another few yards, and the beam of our lights slid fully over them. 2 clean lines, ridged with tread marks, cut into the snow dust on top of the ice. They were fresh. Snow had not yet filled them. They ran straight as an arrow alongside us before curving slowly toward the right bank. "No one was ahead of us when we left," Hayden said quietly. "Maybe someone came from the other side last night," I suggested. "In this?" He gestured at the window, where the darkness pressed thick and close. It was not storming yet, but the cold seeped into everything. No sane driver would be out here alone in the dead of night unless they had a good reason. The schedule had no other runs logged for this window. We would have heard them on the radio, unless the radio had been dead then too. The tracks veered farther right, leading toward a section of bank where the snow had piled high in dark, low shapes. Hayden slowed a little, his jaw tight. The ice under us groaned, a low, distant sound that vibrated up through the chassis and into our bones. "Stay on the markers," he said. "Do not look at them. Just notice if they cross." They did not cross. They paralleled us for another few minutes, then angled more sharply toward shore. As the beam of our lights followed, the banks fell away for a stretch into a low, shallow bay I remembered from summer fishing trips. The ice there had formed later, thinner, over slower water. Even now, it looked different. The surface seemed darker, covered in a patchy crust that did not reflect as much. The phantom tracks went straight onto it. "Idiot," Hayden breathed. "They're going to put themselves right through." Except there was no "they." No red glow from taillights, No dim smear of headlights in the distance. The tracks simply flowed ahead, curving gently around a cluster of snow-humped rocks, like someone steering, then continuing deeper into the darker ice. I held my breath, waiting for the sudden break, the jagged splinter of a collapsed section. It did not come. "Can we stop?" I asked. "Just for a second. Maybe we should—" Without warning, the radio crackled back to life. Not with voices, with noise. A sharp, piercing tone that started low and climbed in a slow, steady rise, like a siren someone had stretched out. It set my teeth on edge. Hayden winced and reached to dial the volume down. As his fingers brushed the knob, the tone cut off, replaced by a burst of garbled sound. It took me a moment to realize I was listening to us. Our own voices spilled out of the speakers, delayed and distorted. My nervous, "Do you see that?" Hayden's muttered, "In this?" The sound was slightly off, like hearing yourself on a cheap recording. Over the top of it, faint but clear, there was another sound layered in. A distant hollow knocking, like something heavy striking wood. 3 beats, then silence. 3 beats, then silence. "Turn it off," I whispered. Hayden did. The radio went dead again. The only sound left was the engine and the faint squeak of the steering wheel under his gloves. When we looked back at the ice, the other tracks had vanished. One moment they were there, a clear set of lines veering into danger. The next, the surface ahead was smooth, unmarked, just the faint scars of age-old cracks frozen into place. I blinked, leaned forward until my shoulder pressed into the dash, and scanned every inch our lights touched. Nothing. "We did see them," I said. It was not a question. "Yeah," he said. His voice was tight. "We did." We did not talk much after that. The rest of the drive to the halfway shelter passed in a thick, uneasy quiet. Once we were off the river and on beaten ground again, the radio returned to normal. Static, then dispatcher's bored voice checking our position. We lied and said everything was fine. At the shelter, a squat building thrown up on a rise above the valley, Hayden parked and killed the engine. "Come on," he said. "We will check the ice reports and the logs." Inside, the shelter smelled like wet wool and old coffee. A laminated map of the river and its seasonal road hung on one wall, covered in marker notes about thickness and trouble spots. A clipboard dangled from a nail beside it. Hayden flipped through the pages, his finger tracing dates and scribbled entries. "Here," he said, tapping one line. "Last season, same stretch. A driver reported seeing another rig's tracks veer off toward the bay. No truck, no break in the ice. He wrote that he thought he was hallucinating." Another line, lower on the sheet, 2 years earlier. "Unexplained cracking noises. Sound like knocking. Radio interference. Advised to proceed with caution." Hayden let the clipboard hang. "No one likes this section, but they keep using it. Shortest route." For the rest of that winter, we crossed that bay dozens of times. Sometimes, the ice under us was eerily quiet. Sometimes it groaned and popped like it was breathing. Twice more, just at the edge of the headlight's reach, I thought I saw faint indentations running alongside our path, like the memory of tracks just beginning to fade. I think about those phantom tire marks more than I want to. Did a truck go through there once, years back, in the middle of the night? The ice too thin and the driver too tired? Did the river take them so cleanly that no one ever found a trace? Or is it something older than trucks, older even than our village, using the thin places to show us how quickly we can leave the surface of the world if we are not careful? People in town still call the ice road a blessing. Without it, the shelves would go empty and the fuel tanks dry. But every time someone heads out in the dark, my stomach knots. Because out there on the frozen river, there is a place where tracks appear with no driver, and radios play your own words back to you from a few minutes in the future, wrapped in a sound like heavy knuckles tapping under a coffin lid. People like to romanticize dog mushing. They picture the postcard version, crisp air, northern lights, the happy yelps of dogs pulling a sled through powdered snow. There is some of that, sure, but there is another side that no brochure mentions. The side where the only light comes from your headlamp. The temperature is so low, your breath freezes in your nose, and there is nothing but shifting shadows in the tree line for miles. That is the side where I met the thing that followed my team during the polar night. I run mail and supplies between two small villages in the interior, a route my grandfather started before there was a winter road, and my father kept alive when fuel got too expensive for snow machines. I like the work. The dogs like to run, and I like the rhythm of their bodies moving as one, the steady hiss of the sled over snow. During polar night, the runs get trickier. You time them between storms, check ice thickness constantly, and trust your team to know the trail when your own eyes are failing. The night it happened, the cold had dropped to a level I could feel in my teeth. The aurora was out, a dim smear low on the horizon, but clouds thickened above us like something heavy closing its hand. I left the first village just after what the clock said was evening, planning to reach the cabin halfway along the route by midnight. From there, I would rest the team, thaw my beard, and push on to the next town by dawn. Simple plan. The trail was one I knew nearly as well as my own hands. The first few miles went smoothly. The dogs were fresh and eager, paws drumming the packed trail. Their breath steamed in rising ghosts. My headlamp carved a thin tunnel through the dark, catching the occasional reflective stake someone had pounded into the snow to mark sharp turns. The only sounds were the runners scraping, harness lines creaking faintly, and the quiet panting of the team. About an hour in, the woods closed around us. Spruce and birch leaned over the trail, branches knitting together overhead and swallowing what little sky glow there had been. The snow here was deeper. The light from my lamp bounced back from trunks and drifts, making it harder to see past the first rank of trees. This stretch always made me a little uneasy, but the dogs usually powered through it without complaint. Not that night. It started with a hesitation. The lead dog, a big gray female named Mist, slowed to a jog, ears pricked forward. The rest of the team checked themselves to avoid tangling the lines. I put a boot on the drag mat, letting the sled ease back. Ahead, the trail curved slightly to the right, disappearing between dark trunks. "G Mist," I called, giving the command for right. "Hike up." Normally, she would flick an ear, maybe glance back once, and then obey. This time, she stayed planted, muscles bunched, every hair along her spine standing up. A low growl rumbled out of her chest, vibrating down the line. The others picked it up, hackles lifting, bodies going rigid. "Easy," I murmured, more for myself than for them. "What do you smell?" The woods were silent. No wind, no creaking branches, no distant snow machining from some hidden camp. Just my own breath, loud in the confines of my hood, and the faint jingle of metal as one of the dogs shifted. The beam of my headlamp played over trunks, brush, and snow. Nothing moved. Then something stepped just beyond the reach of the light. I did not see it fully at first. I felt it. The sound was subtle, a soft, heavy crunch in the snow to our left, perfectly timed to my own heartbeat. Then another, closer, the vibration of it traveling up through the crust and into the runners of the sled. It was not the scrabble of a fox or the light patter of a hare. It was weight. Something big, moving on two legs, pacing us in the dark. Mist's growl deepened. The dogs closest to the left side of the trail strained away from the sound, leaning right against their harnesses. The sled shifted, skidding slightly. I dug my heels harder into the drag mat and fought down the urge to swing my headlamp directly toward the noise. Some old instinct hummed in my bones, the part of me that had grown up on stories of what you do not look at if you want to get home. "Let us go," I said softly, lips numb. "Hike." Mist whined, a high, uncertain sound I had heard from her only once before during a storm when the wind had knocked trees down across the trail. Then, at last, she lurched forward. The others followed, glad to be moving again. The runners hissed, snow squeaking under the weight. Whatever was pacing us moved with us. Every time the team's stride lengthened, the crunch of its steps matched. I kept my eyes on the narrow strip of trail ahead, but some betrayable part of my vision tracked the shadows at the edge of the beam. Once or twice, I caught the impression of something pale between the trees, too tall to be a person on snowshoes, too narrow in the chest for a bear. It kept just out of full view, using the trunks like a hunter using cover. The rhythm of its movement was wrong. It moved smoothly, no bob of shoulders, no sway, like a marionette gliding rather than walking. For nearly a mile, it followed us. The dogs knew. Dogs always know. They stopped listening to my small steering corrections and focused entirely on getting through that corridor of trees. Their ears pinned back, their tails tucked. I could feel the tremor in the gang line when the thing stepped closer, close enough once that I heard the faint scrape of its weight against a low branch. My skin crawled. I wanted to shout, to bang the side of the sled, to fire my rifle into the air and assert that I was not prey. But the part of me that had listened to my grandfather's stories about things that lived between the trees clamped my teeth together. Making noise, he used to say, just tell some things exactly where you are. Eventually, the trail dipped and the trees thinned. I recognized a crooked birch on the right, its trunk bent almost in a question mark shape. Shortly after that, the path would break into a small clearing, a patch of open muskeg where the sky felt a little bigger, even in the polar night. I fixed that memory in my mind like a lifeline. Just get there. Just reach the open. The crunching steps drew nearer. The dogs were nearly running sideways now, desperate to put the trail between themselves and whatever lurked in the dark. Mist kept flicking her gaze left and then wrenching it forward again. The clearing felt like it was taking too long to appear, as if the woods had stretched themselves just to keep us inside them. When we finally burst out onto the open patch, the sky above us widened into a shallow bowl of deep blue. The clouds had thinned enough that the aurora showed through, rippling faintly like the underside of a giant snake. The dogs surged, relieved, tongues lolling. I lifted my head and let my lamp beam sweep a bit farther left, just for a second. That was when I saw it. It stood at the line where the trees ended, one long arm resting casually against a trunk. In the cold wash of my headlamp, its body looked almost the same color as the snow, but smoother, like packed ice. It was tall, at least a head taller than me, even without the advantage of higher ground. Its limbs were too long, joints slightly backward, as if someone had assembled it from the right pieces, but in the wrong order. Where its face should have been was a flat, blank oval, broken only by a slit that suggested a mouth. Above that slit, 2 points jutted up and back, branching like antlers that had grown out at the wrong angle, crooked and jagged, tipped not toward the sky but inward, curving around its own head like a cage. For a heartbeat, it did not move. Neither did I. The dogs, sensing the open space ahead, had begun to pick up speed and the sled lurched forward, tugging me off balance. My lamp jittered, the beam wobbling over the thing's chest. Its surface caught the light like frost. Then it tilted its head. The motion was slow, deliberate, like it was studying me from every angle the way people do with roadkill, curious but not sympathetic. As the dogs dragged us farther into the clearing, its long fingers tightened on the tree trunk. I heard the faint crack of bark splintering, and then in one smooth shift, it stepped backward, vanishing into the gloom among the branches. The forest swallowed it, as if it had never been there. I did not realize I had been holding my breath until my lungs burned. I sucked air in that felt like knives. My hands shook on the handlebar. The dogs ran harder now, eager to be away, strings of drool freezing on their muzzles. I did not encourage them. I just let them go. We reached the halfway cabin later than usual. The small structure squatted in a shallow bowl of snow, its windows dark until I lit the lantern inside. Once the dogs were fed and bedded down in straw, I went back out with my headlamp and walked the perimeter of the clearing, boots crunching. I told myself I was just checking for fresh predator tracks, making sure no wolves or bears had followed us in. My light scanned the snow, passed over the normal chaos of paw prints and my own boot marks. There were other impressions too. Not full footprints. The surface was too hard for that. But long, narrow gouges where something heavy had dragged briefly, like claws skimming the crust as it paced just inside the tree line. On one birch near the trail's entrance, the bark had been torn away in 4 parallel grooves, each the width of my thumb, exposing pale wood beneath. I ran my glove over them. The sap had not yet frozen solid, meaning the damage was fresh. I slept badly that night, if you could call it sleep. Every creak of the cabin made my muscles lock. Once I dreamed the handle of the door was slowly turning, though I knew I had bolted it from the inside. The dogs barked 3 separate times, sharp, warning bursts, then quieted on their own. When gray light and a hint of aurora shimmer finally bled through the small window that passed for morning, I got up feeling older than I had the day before. On the way to the next village, the dogs refused to go near the same stretch of woods. Instead of taking the trail back through that corridor, I broke a new path across open country, skirting a frozen slough and adding an hour to the trip. It tired the team more, burned more calories, put us at greater risk of hitting hidden overflow. I did not care. The memory of that blank, tilted face and those inward hooking antlers sat in my chest like a piece of ice I could not cough up. When I told a few people in town what had happened, I got 2 sorts of reactions. The outsiders, the seasonal folks, laughed it off. They suggested mice identified branches, imagination, too many old stories. The elders did not laugh. One old woman listened without interrupting, her eyes getting narrower with each detail. When I finished, she nodded once. "Some things follow the herds," she said. "And some things follow the dogs. They liked when people traveled slower. They had more time to walk alongside. We do not say their names, but you did well not to look too soon." I asked her if it would come back. She looked toward the window, where the first hints of true dawn would not appear for weeks yet, and shrugged. "If you keep to the open and your dogs keep speaking up, maybe not," she said. "But the woods remember who has seen them. Do not give them your fear for free." I wish I could say that advice helped. Maybe in some ways, it does. I still run that route. The mail has to move. The villages still need fuel and food. But now, even when I am alone on a clear night and the trail is firm and familiar, every time the trees close in around us, I feel my shoulders tighten and my eyes pull toward the edge of the lamp's reach. The dogs know. Their ears swivel. Their noses taste the air. And sometimes, just beyond the last trunks, where the darkness grows thickest, I catch the faint impression of a shape keeping pace with us, always just far enough away that I cannot be sure I am seeing anything at all. The village did not have a name on any map I ever saw. On paper, it was just a cluster of old coordinates off the southern coast, marked once as seasonal fish camp, and then forgotten when the families who built it moved inland. But everyone in my town called it Last Light, and they only said the name when the days were still long and the sea not yet locked in ice. During polar night, they just called it that place and looked away from the shoreline. I heard the stories first like everyone else, half whispered over coffee at the trading post, or muttered by uncles who pretended they did not believe in anything they could not fix with a wrench. They said the village had emptied in a single winter, when someone brought back something from the ice. They said you could still see lamps burning in boarded-up windows during the darkest weeks, even though no one had lived there in decades. They said if you went there after the sun was gone, you would meet the last man, and he would decide whether you went back home or stayed with him in the dark. So of course, when my friend suggested we snowmobile out to the island during polar night, I said yes. There were 3 of us that night. Me, Spencer, and Harper. We'd grown up together in a town that clung to the coastline like lichen to a rock. The 3 of us had done all the usual stupid things teenagers in remote places do. We had driven too fast on frozen lakes, jumped from cliffs into the water before it was truly warm, and taken boats out farther than our parents would have allowed. Last light felt like just another dare. We waited for what passed as evening, a little after dinner when the sky had deepened from dark blue to full black, and the faint smear of twilight had finally died. The aurora was low, a thin green band over the western horizon. The sea ice between our town and the island had set weeks ago. Locals had cut a trail with their machines to haul gear to offshore nets, but no one went all the way to last light. The poles marking the safe route turned away from it as if on purpose. Spencer had the biggest machine, an old battered beast that could haul a trailer and still outrun the smaller sleds. Harper and I rode our own, lighter, newer, with headlights that cut sharp cones through the blowing snow. The air was brittle cold, so dry it burned in our noses. Our breath turned to crust on the edges of our balaclavas. "Just a look," Spencer had said at my door. "We go out, snap a few photos, come back. No hero stuff." Harper had laughed, eyes bright over her scarf. "We will finally have something better to talk about than my uncle's ghost stories." Out on the ice, the noise of the town fell away fast. The engines filled the world, but beyond that, everything felt hollow. No waves under us, just solid, layered frost. The trail stakes marched out toward the black shape of the island like a procession of thin ghosts. We followed them for a while, then, at a point where they veered slightly right toward the net grounds, Spencer raised his arm and angled left, off the marked route. "Shortcut," his voice crackled over the helmet radios. I hesitated. Every sign, every spray-painted warning, every lecture about staying between the poles flashed through my mind. My handlebars vibrated under my gloves. Harper's sled pulled up beside mine, her eyes on me. "You scared?" she yelled, her voice muffled by her helmet and the wind. "Yes," I wanted to say. "We are not supposed to go that way." Instead, I shook my head and followed Spencer's taillight into the dark. The island grew slowly, a low hump of black against the deeper black of the sky. As we drew closer, the pale rectangles of houses emerged out of the snow. They were small, mostly one-story cabins built of gray, weather-chewed wood. Their roofs sagged under drifts. Windows were boarded from the inside on some, broken out on others. A rusted skiff leaned at an angle, half buried near the shore, like something trying to crawl away and frozen mid-escape. We cut the engines on a flat stretch of packed snow just beyond the first row of houses. The sudden silence rang in my ears. Wind tugged at loose shingles somewhere, a dry rattle like bones in a can. Farther inland, something creaked. A sign, a door, I could not tell. Spencer flipped his visor up and grinned, his face red from the cold. "See? No ghosts. Just old wood and bad weather." Harper swung a leg off her sled and stomped her boots. "It feels wrong," she said, though she was smiling too. "Like we are walking into a picture that does not want us here." She was right. There was a stillness to the place that was different than the quiet of our own sleeping town. It was not the pause of people in their houses with lights off and stoves banked low. It was the absence of people entirely, a vacuum where human noise should be. No dogs barking, no generator hum, no faint radio. Just the wind and the distant dull crack of ice shifting somewhere under the sea. We walked between the houses, our headlamps sweeping over warped doors and boarded windows. Snow had drifted into strange shapes against the walls, making it look like the buildings themselves were trying to climb out of the ground. Someone had left a pair of boots on a stoop decades ago and never come back for them. They were fused to the planks now, leather petrified. "Look at this," Harper said, pointing to a window on the second cabin. The glass was intact, miraculously, but the inside was so coated with frost that it looked like white velvet. In one clear patch near the bottom, the curve of a handprint showed where someone had pressed from within at some point long ago. We circled the main row and ended up in what must once have been the village's center. A few larger buildings clustered there. A communal hall, maybe, a storage shed. An old pole for hanging nets jutted up at a crooked angle. Above it all, on a slight rise beyond the last houses, stood a single structure that looked newer than the rest, though that was impossible. Its paint had peeled, but more recently, The boards were less warped, the roof sharper. A light was on in the window. I stopped dead. My breath stuttered in a plume of frost. The others nearly walked into me. "What?" Spencer asked, then followed my gaze. "Oh." A lamp burned in the front room of that house, yellow and soft. Not the harsh electric glare of a generator bulb, but the warmer glow of an oil lantern. It flickered faintly, as if disturbed by a draft, casting moving shadows across the inside of the glass. For one insane second, I thought maybe we had been wrong. Maybe some family had moved back out here to live alone on the island. But as we watched, the light did not brighten or dim. It just burned, steady as a heartbeat. "No one lives here," Harper whispered. "Right?" We would have known. Word would have spread. Supplies would have been hauled. No one comes out to a place like this in the dead of winter without the whole coast gossiping about it. As we stood there, the front door of the lit house creaked open. A man stepped out onto the small stoop. He was not bundled in layers the way we were. He wore a heavy coat, yes, and boots, but no hat, no scarf over his mouth. His hair was gray and long enough to brush his collar. His face was lined, not just with age, but with the peculiar weathering the sea gives to those who live close to it. He looked, in that moment, like any older fisherman you might see leaning on a railing in town watching the tide. He raised one hand. The gesture was slow and deliberate. Not a wave exactly. More like a warning signal, palm out, as if he were stopping traffic on an invisible road. His eyes caught the reflection of our headlamps and flashed briefly, animal brilliant. For a long moment, no one moved. Then he pointed, not at us, but past us, toward the black expanse of sea ice behind. "We should go," Harper said. Her voice shook. Spencer cleared his throat, trying for a brave grin and not quite making it. "Hey," he called, cupping his hands around his mouth. "We did not mean to bother you. We were just—" The wind snatched his words. The man did not answer. He did not appear to breathe. His raised hand did not tremble. He stood in that half-open doorway, like a carved figurehead on the bow of a ship. I took a step backward without realizing it, boots crunching. "Spence," I said, "he does not want us here." As if in response, every light in the other houses, lights we had not even noticed as off because they had never been on, flicked simultaneously to life in my mind. It was as if I had suddenly become aware of exactly how dark every other window was, how no glow seeped from cracks or curtains anywhere but that single house. The lit window behind the man now felt wrong, like a trick of the eye, a slice, cut into the dark where something waited. Spencer opened his mouth to try again, then stopped. The man had lowered his hand and turned his face slightly toward the village behind him. He did not look at us. He looked at the empty houses, the silent doors, the drifted over paths. Then he nodded once, a tiny motion, as if answering a question only he heard. Without another gesture, he stepped backward. The door closed. The light in the window went out. The three of us stood frozen for a few seconds longer, each waiting for one of the others to laugh, to say something that would make the hairs flatten on the backs of our necks. No one did. The wind picked up, gusting between the buildings hard enough to push at our coats. Somewhere behind us, out on the ice, there was a low, hollow sound, like something massive shifting under the frozen surface. It reminded me, painfully, that we had come across the sea to reach this place, and that the way home was not guaranteed to stay solid forever. "Back on the sleds," I said. "Now." We did not argue. The engines roared back to life, with a strangled kind of relief. We turned our machines toward the faint line of shore lights far across the ice and followed our own tracks back, careful this time to angle toward the marked trail instead of cutting straight. No one spoke on the ride home. The radio hissed occasionally with static but carried no voices. When we reached town, the lights of our houses looked different, warmer, frailer, as if a strong enough wind could have blown them all out the way the lamp in that house had gone dark. We parked, stomped the snow from our boots, and walked together to Harper's kitchen without even discussing it, drawn by some shared need to be inside walls that people still live behind. Harper's grandmother was sitting at the table when we came in, hands wrapped around a mug, eyes on the window. She looked up as we stamped in, her gaze moving from our faces to the drift of snow still melting off our jackets. "You went out there," she said. Not a question. Spencer opened his mouth, then shut it. I nodded. "Did you see him?" she asked. The air felt thick. "The man in the last house," I said. "He came to the door. He told us to go without speaking." Her grandmother's shoulders sagged slightly, as if a tension she had been holding for years had finally had somewhere to land. "He is kind to you then," she said. "He did not always warn people. Years ago, when the days first stopped, they heard a singing under the ice. Promises of full nets, of light when the sun would not rise. The village stayed when they should have left. All at once they realized the voices did not come from the sea or the sky, but from somewhere in the empty spaces between. They walked away as one on the last day, but one man turned back at the edge. He said, 'I will stay to make sure no one else listens.'" She looked at each of us in turn, her gaze sharp. "The story says if you see him and he lifts his hand, you leave. If you see him and he beckons, you're already lost." I thought of that steady, raised palm and the way he had pointed past us to the ice. I thought of the hollow sound from beneath our machines as we fled. I thought of the handprint on the frosted window, left by someone who had pressed against the glass from inside and never opened the door. We never went back to Last Light. When newcomers in town asked about the row of dark houses they could barely see on clear days, we shrugged and said it was just some old empty place, not worth the fuel to visit. But every year, when the sun slips away and the polar night settles in, there is a night when the clouds break and the aurora hangs low over the sea. On those nights, if you stand at the edge of town and look toward that black bump of an island, you might swear you see a single dim glow in one window, burning like a warning buoy in a dead harbor. And if you feel, without knowing why, that someone is watching to make sure you do not follow that light across the ice, you are probably right. The last time I saw Harper, she was standing in the doorway of the clinic with her hood down and her cheeks flushed from the heat inside, insisting for the 100th time that it was literally 5 minutes to her cabin, and she did not need a ride. The snow had started coming down sideways by then, thick and dry, and the wind was already picking up that hollow howling note it gets right before a real whiteout. I remember thinking I should force the issue, call her supervisor, make it an order instead of a suggestion. Instead, I let her laugh and wave me off and watched her disappear into the dark. I work as a nurse in a fly-in village in western Alaska. That winter, we were down a provider, short on meds and long on hours. Polar night had settled in like a heavy blanket. We lived by the clock and the brightness of our indoor bulbs, not by the sky. Harper and I shared the night shift for a run of days, so long it blurred into one continuous stretch of ringing phones, coughing kids, and the slow, steady beep of the one cardiac monitor that still worked. The night she vanished, it was my turn to stay at the clinic and hers to go home first. She lived just outside the central cluster of houses in a small rental cabin tucked near the edge of the muskeg. On clear nights, you could see its porch light from the clinic's back door, a faint yellow dot against the flat expanse of snow. She joked that if we ever had a mass casualty, she could just sprint over in her socks. That evening, a storm rolled in off the coast faster than the forecast had promised. By the time our last patient left, a middle-aged man with a sprained wrist and a blood pressure problem, the windows were a blur of white. Wind drove snow against the glass so hard it sounded like a handful of sand thrown over and over. The radio crackled with weather bulletins. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. "You should sleep on the cot," I told her, nodding toward the small room we kept for medevac delays. "It will blow over by morning." She pulled on her parka, fingers quick from habit. "I have to feed the dog," she said. and I am not getting out of tomorrow's shift by being lazy tonight. It is literally one trail. I can walk it blindfolded." "That is what I am worried about," I said. "You will be halfway home before you realize you cannot see your own feet." She grinned, that sideways smile she used when she knew she was pushing it. "If I get lost, I will just follow my footprints back." The thing about the polar night is that it makes you underestimate distance. The familiar can feel closer than it is, the strange farther. I stood in the doorway and watched as she stepped out into the screaming dark, pulled her hood up, and tightened her scarf. Her headlamp cut a narrow cone through the blizzard, illuminating the packed trail we all use to get to the clinic. She gave me one last gloved wave, then turned and walked into the storm. The beam of her light disappeared in less than 10 seconds. I told myself she would text when she got in. She usually did. A quick message about the dog, the stove, a joke about frozen eyelashes. 15 minutes passed, then 20. I busied myself with inventory and wiping down surfaces, all things that could have waited, but I did not want to sit and stare at the window. When my phone finally buzzed, I grabbed it so fast I almost dropped it. It was a system glitch notification from the satellite internet, not Harper. By the time 30 minutes had crawled by, my stomach was a hard knot. I stepped out the back door and tried to see her porch light. There was nothing but a wall of swirling snow. The village's main generator hummed somewhere behind me, but the sound was damped by the wind, eaten by the storm. I could have shouted her name at the top of my lungs and the sound would have gone nowhere. I told myself she had made it and gone straight to sleep. I told myself to stop catastrophizing. I waited another 10 minutes. Then I called her. The call went straight to voicemail. I called again and again, each time with the same dull click and recorded message. I stood in the clinic's fluorescent glow, with the phone pressed to my ear and the wind screaming outside, and realized I was holding my breath. At 45 minutes, I grabbed my own parka. The clinic shares a wall with the small public safety office. I did not have to go far to find someone to tell. The village officer on duty that night, an older man named Reed, looked up from his paperwork when I came in, snow still clinging to my shoulders. "Harper walked home," I said. "She should have been there by now." He frowned. "How long?" "Almost an hour." He stood up without another word, pulled on his gear, and radioed 2 volunteers. Within 10 minutes, 3 of us were standing outside the clinic in the full rage of the storm, headlamps and handheld lights cutting weak tunnels through the white. The cold hit me like a slap, sucking the air from my lungs. "We stick to the trail," Reed shouted over the wind. "We fan out in pairs later if we have to." The trail between the clinic and Harper's cabin was normally a simple arc, hugging the backs of a few houses before cutting straight across a shallow dip and up to her front steps. That night, it was a faint depression in a sea of blowing snow, already half-filled in places. Our lights bounced off the swirling flakes, turning the world into an endless glowing tunnel. My eyelashes crusted with frost in minutes. We found her footprints about 20 yards from the clinic. At first, they were clear, each boot print stamped into the compacted trail. Then they began to stagger, drifting toward the right, away from the packed path. "Harper!" I yelled into the dark, voice ripped away. "Harper, stop and answer!" No answer came, just the scrape of snow against my hood and the distant low groan of shifting drifts. Reed signaled for us to follow the prints. We did. They veered off the trail entirely after another few yards, angling toward the open muskeg beyond the last houses. That made no sense. She had walked this path 100 times. Even half asleep, she would have felt the difference underfoot between packed snow and the softer, treacherous crust of the open ground. But the prints were hers. I recognized the tread pattern on the soles from 100 shifts of seeing her boots lined up by the clinic door. We followed them into the white. Out past the last house, the storm felt bigger. The small sense of protection you get from being near buildings vanished. The ground dipped and rose in subtle ways, and my feet sank deeper. The wind had scoured some areas nearly to ice and piled others into knee-high drifts. Harper's footprints wandered and crossed themselves, looping in tight, confused circles for stretches, then striking off in straight lines only to curve back and intersect again. "She got turned around," one of the volunteers shouted. "She could not see the lights." I knew he was right, but knowing did not help. The village's glow was a faint smear behind us. Ahead there was nothing but noise and white. We kept going, following the tracks until they suddenly thinned, the impressions shallower, as if she had begun to stumble. Once there was a long, dragging mark where she must have fallen and gotten up again. "Harper!" I screamed, my voice cracked. "Answer me!" Somewhere in the storm, something knocked. A hollow, dull sound that could have been a loose piece of siding miles away. Could have been a chunk of snow sliding off a roof. It sounded, in that moment, like knuckles on a door that no one could open. We searched until the batteries in our lights started to dim, and our faces burned with the kind of cold that means damage. We did not find her that night. The storm forced us back. Leaving those wandering tracks out there felt like abandoning a lifeline, but if we had stayed much longer, we would have joined her in whatever direction she had gone. In the morning, what passed for morning in polar night, the wind dropped. The world was muffled, the sky a low gray ceiling. A larger search went out. Snow machines, fans swept the muskeg. People on snowshoes combed the dips and clumps of scrub. A helicopter from a bigger town flew grid patterns when the ceiling lifted enough to allow it. They found her parka first. It lay folded on a flat rock outcropping almost a mile and a half from the village, neat as if she had taken it off in her own home and set it on a chair. Snow had drifted lightly over it, but the fabric was visible, familiar. Her gloves sat on top. Her hat was tucked inside one sleeve. Around the rock, the snow was pristine. No tracks led to it or away from it. A little farther on, near the edge of a line of low willows, they found her boots. They were side by side, toes pointed toward the village, laces still tied. Inside them, prints in the snow looked like bare feet, each step lighter than the last until they simply stopped. They never found Harper. The official report called it a weather-related disappearance. They used words like disoriented, hypothermia, snow burial. They held a vigil at the school gym with candles and pictures and casseroles. Her family flew in. People cried, then tried to move on. The winter continued. Patients needed stitches and antibiotics. Babies were born. The generator failed twice. Life insisted on going forward. But for those of us who had seen the way her tracks looped and crossed, who had walked out onto that open muskeg in a storm that made the world smaller than a room, the story did not settle so neatly. On nights when the wind dies and the snow lies flat and untouched, I still stand in the clinic doorway sometimes and look toward the place where her porch light used to glow. There are nights, a handful each winter, when I hear a sound in the quiet that does not belong. A soft, irregular tapping on the clinic door when no one stands outside. A faint brushing at the window, as if gloved fingers search for a latch. The first time it happened, my heart leaped. I rushed to the door and flung it open, letting a burst of cold air into the warm room. There was nothing there, just my own footprints in the packed snow, and beyond them, the smooth, unmarked expanse leading toward the edge of town. Now, when I hear it, I do not open the door right away. I stand a moment with my hand on the knob and whisper her name. I tell the empty air that I'm still here, that I still remember the way her headlamp vanished into the storm, that I still see, in my mind, the neat fold of her parka on that rock, and wonder what she saw in the white that made her take it off. Because that is the part that never made sense, even to the investigators. You do not strip down in that kind of cold unless something in your brain has come undone, unless you are so far beyond rational thought that warmth feels like fire and snow feels like water, or unless you are stepping into something that does not care whether you are dressed for it or not. In the months after, I rearranged the supply closet and pretended it was just for efficiency. In reality, I moved the extra blankets closer to the door and the spare boots where I could grab them without thinking. If anyone else ever insists on walking home in a storm, I tell them no and let them be angry. I have learned what 5 minutes in the polar night can do to a person. Harper's cabin stands empty now. The landlord cannot bring himself to rent it out. Some nights when the aurora hangs low and the power flickers, a few people swear they see a faint light in its single front window, like the glow of a headlamp behind thin curtains. When that happens, the village dogs lift their heads, ears pricked, and stare toward that side of town, their eyes shining, in the dark. I do not know if Harper is out there, trying to find her way back along a trail that no longer exists, or if the polar night simply took her and left behind a trail of footprints that crossed themselves until they canceled out. I only know that whenever I lock the clinic door now, I check it twice, then rest my hand on the cold metal and listen, just in case she ever knocks loud enough and with enough of herself still attached that I can open it in time. When I signed the contract to teach in that village, the listing just called the house a rustic single-family dwelling with cold storage. I had lived in cheap basements and student apartments that smelled like mold and fried noodles. I thought I was ready for anything. What I was not ready for was the cellar. The village sat on a low rise above a river, a scatter of houses around a school, a clinic, and a fuel tank farm that hummed all winter. I arrived in late November, just as the last smear of sun vanished and the polar night settled in for real. The principal met me at the small airstrip with a handshake and a snow machine ride to my new place. The house looked fine from the outside, if weathered. Faded blue siding, sagging porch, windows rimed with frost. Smoke curled from the chimney in thin gray threads. "Old place," he said, as we hauled my duffel bags up the steps. "Belonged to a guy who left in a hurry a few years back. You get a deal on the rent if you agree to keep the pipes from freezing." Inside, it smelled like aged wood, canned soup, and something else under that. Metallic, faint, like old pennies. I told myself it was just rusty pipes. The living room was all mismatched furniture and handmade curtains. The kitchen cabinets stuck if you pulled them too hard. In back, a short hallway led to a small bedroom, and a door set lower than the others, with a heavy latch at shoulder level. "That is your permafrost cellar," the principal said, following my gaze. "Locals use them like walk-in freezers. There's a trapdoor just inside and a ladder. Be careful on the rungs. That is about it. Welcome to the North." For the first few weeks, I barely thought about the cellar. I was too busy trying to keep a room full of restless kids focused, while the world outside the school windows stayed black. The polar night did strange things to everyone's sleep. The students came in wired one day, half asleep the next. I tried to stick to routines, bright posters, warm lights. At the house, I cooked on a small gas stove, read by lamp, and pretended the constant wind tapping at the siding was just weather and not fingers. The first time I heard the scraping, I was lying in bed listening to a podcast, the ceiling glowing faintly, with aurora light leaking through the curtains. At first, I thought it was a branch rubbing the siding. Then I remembered there were no trees close enough for that. The sound came again, a slow, deliberate drag directly under the floorboards beneath my bed. Not mice, not the quick scurry of small things. Something heavier, moving in long strokes, then pausing. I muted my phone. The house settled around me with its usual pops and sighs, but under it all, the scrape continued. 3 times, then silence. Right under my mattress, separated only by thin plywood and whatever empty space lay between the joists and the top of the cellar. I told myself it was ice shifting. The ground here was frozen solid, but temperature changes still made things move. Maybe the permafrost was pushing against the foundation. I did not sleep much that night. Every time I drifted off, the scrape pulled me back. Over the next week, the noise returned every few nights. Sometimes it sounded more like tapping than scraping, a slow, irregular knock that traveled along the underside of the floor as if someone were moving room to room below. I tried pounding my heel back in reply once, half joking, half annoyed. The knocking stopped immediately. For a long time afterward, the house was so quiet I could hear my own pulse in my ears. Eventually, curiosity got the better of me. One afternoon, when the school had let out early for a storm and I had no papers left to grade, I stood in front of the cellar door with my hand on the latch, feeling stupidly like a character in a bad horror movie. The metal was cold through my glove. When I lifted it, the door swung inward with a soft groan and a gust of air that smelled like iron and old wood. A square of darkness yawned at my feet, ringed by a rough-cut frame. A wooden ladder descended into it, the rungs slick with frost. I clipped my headlamp to my hat, took a breath, and started down. The cold hit harder with each rung. It was a different cold from outside, less biting wind and more the dense, still chill of buried places. My breath fogged in front of my face and then drifted downward, vanishing into the dimness. The cellar walls were rough concrete, beaded with fine crystals of ice. At the bottom, the light from my headlamp revealed shelves built into two walls, loaded with old mason jars and plastic tubs. Some held clouded ice where food had been frozen in for so long it had become unrecognizable. Others were empty, lids askew. The room was small, maybe 8 feet square, with a packed earth floor gone hard as rock. The ceiling was low enough that I had to duck slightly. Nothing living scurried in the corners, no rat droppings or spider webs. Just the faint sound of the house above, the muffled whistle of wind, and something else. A slight hiss, like frozen air moving through a narrow crack. At the far end, opposite the ladder, a wooden pallet sat on the floor. It looked newer than the rest of the cellar, boards lighter, less stained. Frost had built up around its edges, blooming out of the dirt in thick white ruffles. When I stepped closer, the temperature seemed to drop another notch. My breath smoked heavy. Underneath the pallet, something glinted. It would have been smarter to go back up right then to tell myself that whatever was under there was not my business. Instead, I squatted, fingers already aching from the cold, and grabbed the rough wood. It was heavier than it looked, but I managed to drag it aside a few inches, boots slipping on the packed floor. Beneath it, carved into the earth, was a shallow pit lined with blocks of ice. Someone had cut them cleanly and stacked them like bricks, sealing whatever lay in the middle. The glint I had seen was from something trapped in the cloudy layers, metal, reflecting my headlamp in quick, sharp flashes as I moved. My skin crawled. This was not how you stored moose meat or fish. Permafrost would freeze anything left down here solid without extra effort. Building an ice box inside an ice cellar felt like hiding something from more than just temperature. I leaned closer, squinting. Shapes swam in the clouded ice, rounded, pale. For a second, I told myself they were bones from some old hunt, a cache someone had made and forgotten. Then my light caught the curve of something unmistakably human, a small, smooth arc like the back of a skull, a line of tiny, even bumps like knuckles. I rocked back on my heels so fast I nearly fell. The hiss in the air seemed to grow louder. Under my boots, the ground felt suddenly less solid, as if the frost had thinned. I told myself to leave it, to go upstairs, close the door, and call someone whose job it was to handle things like this. Instead, on shaking legs, I backed toward the ladder, dragging the pallet back into place with the toe of my boot until the ice pit was hidden again. Only when it was covered did I realize I had been holding my breath. On the way up, one of the rungs shifted under my foot. Wood groaned. For a moment I hung there, half in the cellar, half out, heart hammering as visions of myself, broken at the bottom, trapped with that ice, flashed behind my eyes. Then the rung held, and I lunged the rest of the way up, slamming the door behind me with more force than necessary. That night, I lay awake listening for scraping. It did not come. Instead, there was a different sound. A faint, intermittent crackle from beneath the house, like ice thawing and refreezing, snapping under pressure. The metallic smell in the air seemed stronger. When I finally dozed off toward morning, I dreamed of blocks of ice sliding against each other in the dark, grinding slowly, reshaping themselves around something that struggled weakly inside. I reported it the next day. I went to the principal first, voice tight, fingers twisting in the hem of my sweater as I described the cellar, the pallet, the ice. His face went through several shades, from disbelief to discomfort to something like resignation. "We always figured something was wrong in that place," he said quietly when I finished. "The last tenant, he left fast. Did not take much. No one wanted to look too close. People have old ways of storing things, old secrets, you know." "That is not old ways," I said. "There are bones down there." He nodded, gaze distant. "We will call the troopers." They came 2 days later, flying in on a gray morning that barely bothered to lighten the clouds. They suited up, went down into the cellar with their own lights and cameras, and stayed longer than I had. When they came back up, their faces were stiff. One of them asked me to repeat my story, recorder on the table between us, their pens scratching. They did not say much about what they had found. They did not have to. Word gets around. No one ever officially told me what or who had been embedded in that ice. The rumors moved faster than any report. Some said it was the bones of animals and nothing more, arranged to scare off thieves. Others, quieter, said the last tenant had family who never made it to town, that the blocks had been cut each year, added to, reshaped, until you could no longer tell how many people had gone into them. The troopers took photos, measurements, and samples. Then, because the ground was frozen so hard that digging it all out would have meant dismantling the foundation in the dead of winter, they sealed the cellar. They bolted the door, nailed a board over it, and wrote a note in my rental file that the cold storage was not to be used pending further investigation. I moved out at the end of the school year. On the last night I spent in that house, I lay on the couch instead of the bed, as far from the cellar door as I could get, and listened. For the first time since I'd gone down there, the old scraping returned. Slow, patient, traveling along the underside of the floor, as if something were testing the boundaries of its box. I listened until dawn finally bled a thin gray line along the horizon. When the small bush plane carried me away that afternoon, the village shrank beneath us into a scatter of dark roofs on white ground. The house with the cellar looked no different from the others. Smoke curled from its chimney. Someone else had already moved in. Sometimes, on bad nights, I think about that hidden ice pit, the way the blocks were stacked with care, the things caught forever inside. The North is full of places where the past does not rot. It freezes and waits. There are caves with animals in them that fell before my great-grandparents were born, still preserved down to their fur. There are crash sites under glaciers with planes entombed mid-fall. And in one small house, in one small village, there's a cellar where the dead stayed cold so long that someone started to think they belonged there. I still teach, but I do not live alone anymore. I ask, very specifically, about basements before I sign anything. If a landlord mentions a good permafrost cellar, I say no and keep looking. And when the winter nights stretch long and my students tell each other scary stories about things buried under the tundra, I turn on all the lights, keep my voice steady, and do not let myself think about the sound of ice shifting slowly around a set of pale, patient bones. Some people romanticize the idea of disappearing into a cabin for the whole polar night. They imagine themselves wrapped in blankets with a mug of something hot, watching the aurora through frosted windows, while the rest of the world rushes around without them. That was the fantasy I sold myself when I rented the cabin at the edge of the tundra, the one the locals half-jokingly called Noon's End. I told everyone I needed the isolation to finish my book. I did not plan on the extra hours of daylight that should not have existed. The cabin sat alone on a low rise about 5 miles outside a small town in northern Alaska. In summer, There was a rutted track you could drive. In winter, you reached it by snow machine or skis, following a narrow trail marked with old leaning poles. Behind it, the land fell away into endless muskeg and frozen ponds. In front, the tundra sloped gently toward the dull glow of town, a faint smear of light on the horizon. I moved in just before the last sunrise of the year, dragging boxes of books and a laptop bag up the warped front steps. The landlord, a quiet man in his 50s, helped carry in a crate of firewood and a propane tank. Before he left, he stood in the doorway with his hat in his hands and looked at me for a long time. "If you have trouble, you call," he said. "Radio, sat phone, whatever. Do not try to ride it out if it feels wrong." I laughed it off. "I live alone in the city most of the time," I said. "This will be quieter, that is all." He did not smile back. "It is not the same kind of quiet," he said. And then he left. For the first week, he seemed wrong. The quiet was exactly what I wanted. The days were a slow dimming of the sky until, one afternoon, the sun skimmed the horizon without ever fully rising, and then slid away for good. After that, the world outside the window stabilized into a deep blue twilight for a couple of hours, and then full blackness again. I kept the cabin lights bright, drank too much coffee, and set myself a schedule. Write for 4 hours, read for 2, sleep whenever I could. The cabin was basic, but solid. One main room with a wood stove and a table, a small kitchen corner with a propane stove, and a tiny bedroom. A single window faced the town. A second, smaller window looked out toward the open tundra behind. At first, I only glanced out that back window to check the weather. There was never much to see, just snow, the faint swell of distant hills, and, on clear nights, the slow river of stars. The first time the noon changed, I thought my eyes were playing tricks on me. I had been there about 10 days. Outside, the sky had settled into its polar night routine, a brief period of deeper blue around midday, then back to black. Inside, I had taped a calendar to the wall and marked off the days in careful red X's to keep some sense of progression. On that particular day, I was at the table revising a chapter when I noticed the cabin was brighter than it should have been. At first, I assumed I had forgotten to turn off one of the lamps. When I looked up, though, I realized the light was coming from the window. Not much, just a thin gray wash, like someone had turned dimmer a notch higher on the sky. I checked the clock. It was 11:45 in the morning, which lined up with when that short brightening usually happened. I watched, expecting it to fade within an hour like it always did. It did not. By the time my clock read 1:30, the dim gray had become a strange, directionless light that made the snow glow and the horizon sharpen. It was not sunrise, not exactly. There was no clear source, no sun disk, no golden edge. It was as if someone had draped a translucent sheet over the whole world, and now light seeped through from everywhere at once. The town's faint glow became unnecessary. I could see the line of roofs and towers more clearly than I should have been able to in midwinter. I stood at the window for a long time, frowning. My rational brain started conjuring explanations. High cloud reflectivity, maybe. Some kind of auroral haze scattering more light. I checked my phone. No alerts. No local chatter about anything unusual. When I stepped onto the porch, the air bit my lungs, but the landscape lay around me in that impossible half-day, clear and sharp. Then I noticed them. At the edge of the tundra, where the white plain met the first darker line of low hills, a row of figures stood. They were too far to make out details, just dark vertical shapes against the snow. Maybe 5, maybe 7. Every time I tried to count, my eyes slipped. They did not move. They did not wave or walk or shift. They just stood there, evenly spaced, like posts someone had forgotten to install with markers on them. My skin prickled. People, I told myself. Hunters, skiers, someone from town. But no trail led to them. The snow between us was unbroken except for the faint track my own boots had made a few days earlier when I had walked a little way out and then returned. These figures had no origin. They simply were. I watched them until the light finally began to thin, around what should have been 3 in the afternoon. As the gray dimmed back toward blue and then black, the figures grew less distinct, blending into the line of hills. When the sky darkened fully, they were gone. That night, I slept badly. The wind pressed against the walls with small hands. The stove popped. Every creak sounded like a footstep in snow. In the morning, or what passed for morning, I told myself I had watched shadows and nothing more. I made coffee, stoked the fire, and tried to lose myself in sentences again. The next day, the false noon came earlier. By 11, the cabin filled with that sourceless light, brighter than any polar night should allow. I checked my clock twice, then my phone, then the cheap analog watch I wore when the battery on everything else died. All 3 agreed on the time. This noon lasted longer, almost 4 hours this time, a strange, stretched plateau of gray. The figures were back. This time they stood closer. Not much, just enough that I could see that they were roughly human-shaped, tall, wrapped in something dark that blurred their outlines. No faces, no distinct clothing. They were still. So still that part of my brain insisted they were some kind of drifted fence posts or dead trees I had never noticed before. Every time I looked away and looked back, though, their arrangement seemed slightly different. A gap where there had not been one. A slight change in spacing. On the 3rd day, the noon came and stayed. Light seeped into the cabin and did not leave. The gray never brightened to real day and never dimmed fully back to night. It just hovered, sickly and wrong, flattening the landscape. I lost my sense of time completely. My body wanted to sleep, but my eyes told me it was midday indefinitely. My stomach growled at odd hours. The clock on the wall insisted hours were passing, but nothing changed outside. The figures had moved again. They no longer formed a line at the horizon. They stood now in a loose semicircle halfway between the hills and the cabin, spaced as evenly as chess pieces. I could count them now, 6. They were about my height, or a little taller. Their heads were tilted slightly forward, as if they were watching something on the ground between us. Once, when the wind died for a heartbeat, I thought I heard a faint, dry rustle from their direction, like fabric stiff with frost flexing. I stopped going out onto the porch. The false noon started to seep into my head. I would sit at the table, eyes gritty, and find myself reading the same sentence over and over. Sleep came in snatches and left me more tired. When I did drift off, I dreamed of standing outside in that gray light, raising my arm the way you do when you try to catch someone's attention. In the dream, I could not tell if I was waving at the figures to stay back or beckoning them closer. One night. The word meant nothing now, but the clock said it was almost 3 in the morning. I woke to find the cabin interior lit with that same colorless glow, even though I was sure I had doused all the lamps. My heart thudded. The curtains over the front window pulsed faintly with light from behind them, like a huge eye opening. My throat felt dry as paper. I got out of bed and walked barefoot and cold into the main room. The air tasted sharp, metallic. At the window, my hands trembled so much I fumbled the edge of the curtain twice before I could pinch it between my fingers and pull it back. The world outside looked exactly as it had in the daytime. Flat, gray, snow unbroken. Town's glow was distant and unnecessary. The difference was that the figures were now only a few yards from the cabin. They stood in a rough crescent, almost at the limit of the small yard, just beyond, where my boot tracks ended. Up close, they were not any easier to see clearly. The light seemed to smear around them. They were more absence than presence, as if the world had holes punched in it in the shape of people. Where faces should have been, there were smooth, featureless ovals a shade darker than the air. Their heads turned, slowly, in unison, until every blank front faced the window. I do not know how long we stayed like that, me inside the glass and them outside it. My breath fogged the pain. Their non-faces reflected nothing. For a terrible moment, I thought I saw my own silhouette standing among them, one dark shape slightly out of step with the rest. My vision swam. I let the curtain fall. Something brushed the outside of the wall, a long, soft scrape like a gloved hand sliding along the logs. Then very gently, there was a knock at the door. Not a pounding, not a rattle, just 3 measured taps. Every instinct I had screamed to answer to open the door and prove no one was there, that it was some quirk of the settling house or ice shifting in the frame. Instead, I backed away until my calves hit the edge of the bed. The knocking did not come again. After a while, the gray light outside thinned, almost imperceptibly, and I realized my clock said it was late afternoon. The false noon ended that day. The next, the sky behaved like it should again. A brief deepening of blue at midday, then black. When I finally forced myself to peer out, the figures were gone. The horizon was empty. The snow between the cabin and the hills lay smooth and undisturbed, delicate crust sparkling in the weak starlight. I lasted 1 more week before I called the landlord and told him I was done. I blamed it on the isolation, on my own frayed nerves. I did not mention the extra hours of light or the silhouettes in the snow. He did not sound surprised. "No one stays the whole winter anymore," he said. "Not alone." Back in the city, surrounded by street lamps and traffic and human noise at all hours, I sometimes wake at exactly noon to a very specific quality of light sliding around the edges of my blackout curtains. A flat gray that should not be there. When that happens, I lie very still and listen, half convinced I will hear 3 soft knocks at the door. I have not finished the book. I'm not sure I ever will. Every time I sit down to write about that winter, my sentences thin the way that light did, stretching too long, losing their edges. It feels less like telling a story and more like opening a door in a place I no longer live. Whatever waited outside that cabin liked routine. It liked schedules and habits. It expanded noon the way a hand might pry open a crack in frozen wood, just far enough to slip through. Some nights, when the city is quiet and the clouds hang low, I catch myself counting the hours between dusk and dawn, making sure they add up to what they should. So far, they always do. The runway lights out here look like someone dropped a string of cheap Christmas bulbs in the middle of the tundra and forgot to plug in the rest of the world. On clear nights, you can see them from miles away, a tiny crooked line of yellow in a sea of black. During polar night, they are the only proof that planes can still find this place at all. I know those lights better than I know my own reflection. That is why I know what I saw that night was wrong. I have been an aircraft mechanic at a small Alaskan airstrip for 8 years. It is not glamorous work. I de-ice wings, change tires in sub-zero wind, and coax ancient heaters back to life so pilots can feel their fingers long enough to get off the ground. We are the last stop before real nothing. No road, no rail, just snow and sky. During polar night, the schedule shrinks, but it never stops. Mail planes, medevac birds, and bush pilots still come and go on whatever windows the weather gives them. The flight everyone remembers left on a Tuesday. It was a small single-engine turboprop, the kind that shuttles miners and survey crews to camps dotted across the interior. The pilot, a guy named Mason, had flown here for years, solid, cautious. He did not push his luck. That afternoon, though outside it looked like late evening, we fueled his plane, checked his de-ice boots, and watched 3 men in heavy parkas climb aboard with their duffels. They were headed to a site 300 miles east, racing a storm that would close the whole region for days. I stood at the edge of the apron with my flashlight, signaling him down the taxiway. Snow hissed lightly under the tires. The runway lights glowed dull orange in the dark. Overhead, the clouds were low, pressing against the thin circle of light like a lid. Mason lined up at the threshold, paused for his checks, then pushed the throttle forward. The engine roared. The little plane gathered speed, nose lifting until it broke from the ground in a clean arc and disappeared into the black. The radio crackled as he called his departure. Then the tower settled back into the usual hum of other traffic far away. The storm line on the radar looked ugly, but it was still a smear on the distant edge of the screen. If he kept his speed, he would be on the ground at the camp before it reached him. Everything about it was normal, routine. About 20 minutes later, the headset on the duty controller's head squealed with a burst of static, then a clipped transmission. November. The tail number blurred in the noise, but it started like Mason's. Ice building. Losing. Instruments. Say her wrong. There was a grinding shriek, like metal twisting, then silence. The controller tried to raise him. No reply. Another controller stepped in, calmer voice calling on every frequency. Nothing. No emergency beacon pinged. No second call. Just a plane that had vanished into a patch of bad weather with 3 men and enough fuel to get where it was going and back. Search and rescue launched as soon as they could. Helicopters, bigger planes, even a satellite sweep later. They found nothing. No wreckage, no spilled fuel, no heat signature fading in the snow. The official line chalked it up to icing. A crash into deep drifts that had swallowed everything. The families were told as much closure as they were going to get. We hung a wreath by the gate and went back to work. Then, a few weeks into the polar night, I saw the plane come back. It was one of those brittle, cold evenings where the air feels like ground glass, and your eyelashes freeze between blinks. The storm that had swallowed Mason's flight was long gone. The sky above the airstrip was clear and black, stars so sharp they hurt to look at. I was alone on the apron, checking a stubborn fuel truck that did not want to start. The runway lights were on low, glowing dimly along the tarmac. At first, I noticed only the sound. Prop noise is like a voice to people in my job. You know the texture of every regular aircraft on your field. You can hear when someone has changed a blade or babying an engine. The hum that rolled down out of the dark that night was familiar, a certain whine at a particular RPM, a subtle rattle at idle. I straightened up from under the truck hood, frowning, and scanned the approach. There. A pair of landing lights, small and bright, dropping toward the outer marker. My first thought was that dispatch had forgotten to tell me about a late arrival. It happens, especially in winter when everything is chaos. I grabbed my reflective vest, stepped onto the edge of the taxiway, and keyed my handheld radio. Unscheduled inbound, say call sign, I said. No answer. The lights kept coming. As the plane slipped into the glow of the runway lights, my stomach clenched. It was the same model as Mason's bird, same paint scheme, same company logo on the tail, same black anti-glare strip along the nose. Airframes of that type are common out here, but this one had a particular scuff on the left wheel pan I recognized, a scrape from a rock he had clipped the year before. It rolled down the runway like it had just left yesterday. It made no sound. Its landing gear kissed the tarmac in a perfect 3-point. No bounce, no skid. The prop spun without blur, each blade visible as it turned, like it was moving through thicker air than the rest of us. My ears strained for engine noise and heard only the faint hum of the runway lights and my own blood pounding. The plane slowed, then turned unhurriedly onto the taxiway. Its beacon strobed red, washing the snowbank in pulses. The cockpit windows were black. No glow of instruments, no silhouette of a head. I backed away as it drew nearer, muscle memory making me raise my flashlight, and gestured in, regardless of the dread crawling up my spine. It taxied past me at a walking pace. In its side, the passenger windows were dark coins. As it rolled by, a puff of air hit me. Not hot exhaust, but a frigid draft that smelled faintly of ice and something else. Something like ozone after a storm. The plane turned toward the old maintenance hangar, the one we did not use anymore since a newer one had gone up closer to the fuel farm. Its doors were shut, snow banked against them. There was no way to roll anything in there quickly without shovels and a plow, but the plane angled as if the doors were wide open and the space inside lit and waiting. The landing lights washed over the corrugated metal, then swung away as the nose turned slightly, aligning with the shadow between the doors. For a second, it was as if it were hovering. No tire crunch, no engine whine, just a machine pointing at a darkness darker than the night around it. Then it was gone. No roll, no pivot. Just not there anymore. My light jerked wildly, beams skittering over empty tarmac, where the plane had been seconds before. The taxiway was empty all the way to the runway. No fresh tracks marred the thin dusting of blown snow. The only impressions were my own boot prints and the old, half-filled ruts from daytime operations. I stood there, breath steaming, hand shaking around the flashlight for I do not know how long. Eventually, the radio on my belt crackled. The tower asked me to confirm that I had shut down the fuel truck. They wanted to kill the apron lights and save power. My voice sounded wrong when I answered, too high and thin in my own ears. I did not tell them what I had just seen. Who would believe that without evidence? Planes do not vanish on taxiways. They slam into hillsides, sink into lakes, burn on impact. They leave scars on the world. Still, the next morning, curiosity and dread dragged me to the old hangar. Daylight does not mean much in polar night, but a weak gray smudge hung over the horizon. I trudged through powder to the big sliding doors and scraped snow away from the handles. When I heaved them open a few feet, cold air spilled out. The interior was dark, empty, and still. No tire marks. No drip of melted ice, just old oil stains on the concrete and a few broken crates. On the floor, near the center though, directly in line with where the nose of the plane would have been, lay a single object. It was a flight tag, the kind we clip onto passenger bags. The paper was soggy and torn, but the string was intact. Someone had scrawled a name on it in smeared ink. The letters were almost gone, but I could make out 3 clearly. M.A.S. I closed the hangar doors and did not tell anyone about that either. Since that night, I have seen that plane return 3 more times, always in the deepest weeks of polar night, always when the field is quiet, between scheduled flights. Each time the details are the same. The perfect landing, the silent roll, the slow taxi toward the old hangar, the impossible vanishing act. No one else has been on shift with me when it happens. I have started to wonder if it chooses its audience. I do not know if the men who boarded it that Tuesday are in there, flying some endless holding pattern between here and wherever they were meant to go. I do not know if the plane is a replay, a loop the sky cannot quite let go of. I only know that on certain nights when the clouds hang low and the runway lights blink into life against the dark, I hear an engine I recognize where no engine should be. People say the north keeps its dead close. The permafrost holds onto bones. The sea returns wreckage years after storms. Maybe the sky has its own way of remembering. Maybe, somewhere above the clouds, there's a path that plane never left. And every so often it brushes against ours long enough to remind someone like me that not everything lost stays gone. I still work the night shifts. I still de-ice wings and wave tired pilots into their spots. But when a small turboprop lines up at the end of the runway on a dark afternoon and I hear a certain note in the engine's voice, I watch a little closer. I check the tail number twice, and when I walk past the old hangar, I do it quickly. Eyes straight ahead, pretending not to feel the faintest breath of cold leaking from the crack between the doors, as if something inside is still moving, still circling, waiting for permission to land.